strongly influence the productivity of the forest. Then, if you focus on the boreal forest, boreal forest is located in the northern part of the higher latitude part of the northern hemisphere, and usually those ecosystems experience a colder climate. So the climate, like temperature or precipitation, will influence the productivity. Through also climate influence the species richness and biomass, and also the functional diversity. And finally, they also influence the productivity of the ecosystem. So, the relationship between the climate or environmental conditions with the ecosystem functions like the biomass productivity or carbon fixations are very much different between the different environmental conditions, different climatic zones like boreal, temperate, or the tropical forest ecosystems. So now we'd like to try to see how the ecosystems influence the atmospheric condition, like carbon dioxide concentration. This left-hand side graph, you can see this colorful graph, which is showing the long-term changes of the carbon CO2 concentration in the atmosphere in the world. So this vertical axis is the CO2 concentration, and this left-hand side axis is the latitude. So the center is the equator, and then here you have the southern hemisphere, and here you have the northern hemisphere. And this right-hand axis is the year from 1985 to 2020. You can see that as we all understand, the carbon dioxide concentration is increasing all over the world. But you can see that you have some kind of this small-scale changes, fluctuation, as I will say. So why we see this kind of small-scale fluctuation? This is one of the questions that we want to think about by this slide. And one more focus is that if you compare the northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere, this small-scale magnitude of the small-scale fluctuations are different. In the northern hemisphere, the fluctuation is much larger. It means that CO2 concentration has the remarkable changes. And this fluctuation is a kind of annual rhythm. So this high-low rhythm is one of the kind of annual rhythm. And if you compare this kind of temporal fluctuation of the CO2 concentration and the satellite imagery that you can see here, is that it means that if the terrestrial, land ecosystems have their green leaves in spring, summer, or autumn, it absorbs the CO2 from the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. In that period, the atmospheric CO2 has the CO2 concentration is reduced because of the photosynthetic absorption by the land ecosystems. But in the winter or wintertime, when we don't have leaves, or when the temperature is cold and photosynthesis is not working well, or for the lands that you have less precipitation, or you have the very severe water stress or drought, or very high temperature, the photosynthesis of the ecosystem is reduced. Then the atmospheric CO2 concentration is increased. So always the atmospheric CO2 concentration is is reflecting the balance between the ecosystem functions like photosynthesis and also the emission of the greenhouse gas by the human activities. So like this, biodiversity, we know that biodiversity, including ecosystem diversity, species diversity, or genetic diversity, will influence the ecosystem structure and ecosystem functions. Ecosystem structure means that species composition, or plant size, density, or biomass. And ecosystem functions mean that primary production, or food energy chain, carbon nutrient cycling, and environmental regulations. Then all these ecosystem structure and ecosystem functions provide ecosystem services that we call ecosystem service that we utilize for our own daily lives or some resources. But now we are learning that there are severe threats to biodiversity. I attempted to list the 4 items here. Number 1, reduction and extinction of species. Habitat loss due to land cover or land use change and over-exploitation by human. Number 2, unbalancing of ecosystems by biodiversity loss and ecosystem destruction. Number 3, disturbance of ecosystems by invasive species or extreme weather. Number 4, climate change and global warming. Again, this is a kind of brief scheme that's showing the relationship between the ecosystem services and ecosystem services and how all these ecosystem services are related to the human well-being. So ecosystem and biodiversity influence the supporting processes of the ecosystem services, including the nutrient cycling, soil formation, and primary production. And then these basic ecosystem functions give some 3 kinds of ecosystem services, including the provisioning services, regulating services, and cultural services. Then all these different kinds of ecosystem services influence our well-being, like security, or material for the good life, or health, good social relations, and some more other kind of goods and services which support our daily lives. But we have to consider now that changes in climate, ecosystem, biodiversity, and even the human activity influence the ecological issues and societal issues. So because the ecosystems are the fundamental of our society, we have to understand what is happening in the ecosystem and why it is happening, what is the mechanisms, and what would be the consequences of the changing ecosystems with our daily lives. So challenges in biodiversity and ecosystem observation could be listed as here. So I understand many of you are interested in using the satellite remote sensing for the environmental sciences, or some trying to deliver your scientific knowledge or information to the decision-making processes. We need to think about some spatial scale and resolution. For example, structure and functions of ecosystems are heterogeneous over space. And number 2, we have to consider the temporal resolution and frequency of the observations. Because ecological processes are very dynamic, ranging from the seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, or years. And depending on the biological phenomena, you have the different resolution of these temporal changes. Then we have some challenges of those observations. Satellite observation of ecological or biological processes. So the question is that how do we understand the biological or ecological processes from the physical information by remote sensing? All of you know that the remote sensing data is the remote sensing is measuring the physical processes. For example, if you use the optical remote sensing data, all these data are reflecting the radiative reflection from the Earth's surface. These are the physical information. But the question is that how we can convert these physical information into the biological information like photosynthesis or carbon cycling or other types of ecosystem services. So to do that, field measure understanding, in situ understanding on the structure and function of ecosystems are crucial for understanding the status and changes of our environment. Now we are focusing on the CO2 cycling by focusing on photosynthesis and respiration. The carbon cycling between the atmosphere and forest ecosystem is very complex, and I don't go too much detail into this, but we have many processes like photosynthesis or many kinds of respiration in leaves, stems, or soils, or roots, or soil microbes. So we have to understand all of these processes from the ecological viewpoint. Then if we want to understand the processes or mechanisms, then we can expand or we can scale up these understandings or knowledge into the regional scale or global scale. This is the research site in Japan. We have this CO2 measurement infrastructure or this kind of technology to touch on the tree leaves. If you measure the CO2 exchange between the atmosphere and the forest ecosystem, we see that net ecosystem production, this is the budget of the CO2 absorption and CO2 release of the ecosystems. If you see, this is the diurnal changes, and this, if you have the stronger solar radiation, you have the higher CO2 absorption. It means that the higher photosynthetic rates by the trees. And if you measure these CO2 flux all through the year, you can evaluate the CO2 balance between the atmosphere and ecosystems from the January 1st to the December 31st, all through the year. This is a deciduous forest, so we only have the leaves in spring, summer, and autumn. So the net ecosystem production, this is the balance, net absorption of CO2 is only positive in these spring, summer, and autumn in Japan. And if you measure these CO2 flux for many years, we have this kind of seasonal change for multiple years in one place. Then from these data, you can learn how the tree growth or forest growth, forest disturbance or forest regeneration or the climate change can influence the CO2 cycling of the forest ecosystems. I will skip this. So to try to understand the mechanisms, we focus on the seasonality of the trees or the photosynthesis. Then we understand the ecosystem dynamics and ecosystem functions. We have on the tower, we have many kind of infrastructure to monitor the forest ecosystems, like the automated digital cameras. So we can monitor the changes of the forest canopy, leaf development, all through the year and all through the multiple years here. So if you find some images with the green colors, you have these photographs, and then but you can see that the dates of these images are different among the years. It means that the cleanup of the terrestrial ecosystems changes through the multiple years. And I believe that satellite remote sensing can capture this kind of interannual changes of the leaf cleanup. Then if you monitor the autumn leaf falling, leaf coloring or leaf falling, we can see that in some years the leaf coloring starts very early, or in other years the leaves are green even in very deep autumn, late in the year. So also this kind of information can be captured by satellite remote sensing. And the question is how much these changes influence the ecosystem functions. We know that leaf area index of the forest ecosystems changes seasonally or interannually. And also the leaf photosynthetic capacity changes seasonally. And by combining these observed information by the ecosystem function model simulations, then we can understand the forest level photosynthesis changes in the seasonal manner, or the seasonal change is different among the different years because of the changing climate or changing weather conditions, even summertime, spring, and autumn. And because this fluctuated weather or changing climate influence the phenology of the leaves or the photosynthetic activity of the plants. Then I would jump to the some more regional scale or consideration. But based on the our understanding that photosynthesis or forest ecosystem function is influenced by the interaction between the plant biological processes and climate change, then we can deepen our understanding how the climate change or land use change will impact the forest ecosystems, like increase or decrease in plant growth, carbon absorption due to increasing atmospheric CO2, and climate change. This is one of the impacts. Second, disturbance of forest by extreme weather events. This could be also be a very big impact. Or deforestation by human activities, or the destruction of forests by wildfire. So how the global warming could influence the forest ecosystem? Of course, they impact the plant growth, like photosynthesis, or the formation of the canopies. But of course, but not only that, they also global warming or climate change impacts the other organisms like insects, birds, or other kind of animals. Then these dynamics of the many kinds of organisms will be impacted by the climate change. Then, of course, the interaction between these different organisms are also impacted. Then finally, this ecosystem and also their functions and the services are impacted by the global warming or climate change. I would jump to this. And then, for example, I would try to introduce some findings by the regional scale studies that using the satellite remote sensing. For example, my Chinese colleague in Peking University, they have been studying very hard to try to capture the seasonal changes of the land terrestrial ecosystems and also the impacts of the climate change. Then they focused on the green up date or the leaf falling or leaf coloring dates. Then based on their studies for more than 20 years, they found that in the springtime in the northern hemisphere, the spring temperature is rising. And by responding to that, the green updates are getting advanced because the warmer temperature will advance the leaf growth of the plants. Then what happens in autumn? Of course, the autumn temperature is rising, and then leaf yellowing or leaf coloring dates are delaying. This means that warmer temperature will allow the trees to hold their leaves much more longer. These are the trends in the last 20 or 30 years in the northern hemisphere. And then finally, these changes of the length of the growing season, I mean the length period of the greenness. If you have the longer days of the green leaves, then the annual GPP is the gross primary production. This is the total amount of photosynthesis by the ecosystems. It increased like this. If you have a longer term of leaves, you can have many more photosynthesis. And also in our region, in Asia, Oceania, Asia Pacific, West Pacific region, or under say Asia and South Asian region, my colleague in Japan also studies the carbon cycling and the temperature trend by combining the satellite remote sensing data and modeling analysis. So you have the temperature trend and precipitation trend, temperature trend, precipitation trend, and by responding to the changes of the temperature and precipitation, then you have the changes in NDVI, which is the index of the plant growth or productivity. Not only for this steady state changes or long-term changes, the satellite remote, if you combine the satellite remote sensing data and some in situ level understanding on the ecosystem, you can also understand how the extreme summer condition will impact the land ecosystem or terrestrial ecosystems. In 2003, in July and August, we experienced very extreme impact because of the bayou. This is a summer rain front distributing China and Japan. We experienced a very long rainy season here because of the Asian monsoon, but in Southeast Asia you experience a little bit of hot temperature like this. Then what happened? This is temperature and also the radiation. If you have a longer rain, you have a shortage of the radiation. Then it influenced the CO2 fixation of the terrestrial ecosystems right here. So in the area that you had experienced the heavy rain or long rain days, the CO2 absorption in this area was reduced than the other years. So this kind of extreme event happened in East and Southeast Asia in 2003. And in the next, I will introduce what happened to the Europe in the same period. In the July or in August in 2003, the same months, in the same year, in Europe, they experienced the heat wave. Then they had the they had a higher radiation, shortage of precipitation, it means a drought, and higher temperature. And these extreme events impacted the ecosystem, terrestrial ecosystem productivity like this. High temperature and a drought reduced the photosynthesis. And these kind of events are not so much rare in these years. Some group of scientists analyzed the data from the world, and they mapped kind of trends. In the blue part, they found that the shortage of the precipitation or drought are impacting the terrestrial ecosystems. In the red part, they found that the higher heat stress, higher temperature are impacting the ecosystems. So we are experiencing these kind of changes. Now, I would like to, in the next 5 minutes, I only have 7 minutes. So in the next 5 minutes, I will try to briefly introduce how we develop the biodiversity and ecosystem observations. Again, biosphere, I mean ecosystems and biodiversity are basement of our society and economy. So we have to understand what is happening in the biosphere, what will be happening in the biosphere in the future for the sustainable society and economy. Of course, the health is our important aspect. By integrating many kind of data in the world, we know that humans are impacting some biomass or wildness or soil organic carbon or the loss of species richness. So and IPBES, this is the assessment of the biodiversity and ecosystem services. They analyze that humans are impacting the biodiversity and ecosystems. And for if you try to search on Google or something, if you search IPBES, then you can easily find this kind of open access documents that you can learn the status of the biodiversity in your region or in the global level, and how our human activities are impacting this. They also recognize, the IPBES also assess that many organisms, species are vulnerable due to the human activities, and also we are experiencing the species loss, biodiversity loss in the world. And such changes in the biodiversity or ecosystems are impacting our environmental processes or goods and services and other kind of ecosystem services. There are different kinds of the services or natural contribution to people, but you can see that everything is decreasing. It means that human impact and climate change are impacting our ecosystem and then the ecosystem services. So we have a kind of research question in our region. So how the climate change influence the ecosystems in the world. And also we know that we have the kind of heterogeneity in our region. And what are the critical aspects of the biodiversity and ecosystems in our region that contribute to sustainability of the Earth systems and also our society? And third one is that how does growing spatial gradient of economic development or societal activities in our region impact the biodiversity, ecosystem services, and goods and services, and how they impact the ecosystem resilience to the climate change, and how do the increasing extreme climate events and land use change influence the ecosystem function and services and our society. These are still the questions that we have to try to address. So in our Asia-Pacific, Asia-Oceania region, we have the Biodiversity Observation Network, which is a network of scientists, institutions, or sometimes governments that focusing on the biodiversity and ecosystems. In the Asia-Oceania geo, this AP Bond has been working actively in the last 12 years. We are trying to connect the satellite remote sensing, ecosystem observations on the ground or in the ocean, and the biodiversity observation. Some of the outcomes are already referred to the IPBES regional assessment report. For example, in our region, we have variety of the biome or the ecosystem right here. And in this region, we are doing some biodiversity observation by setting some research plots. And by repeatedly measuring, observing the trend status of the biodiversity, we can understand the changes of the biodiversity and the reason of such changes. For example, in the terrestrial system, our colleague is still finding the new plant species in our region because our region is one of the great biodiversity hotspot in the world. Still, we have many species that we don't know. And in my colleague in Thailand is doing some satellite remote sensing and modeling studies to try to evaluate the ecosystem services in the Mekong Basin. For the marine group, they are mapping the ecologically and biologically significant areas for the coastal region with high biodiversity in the coastal or marine ecosystems. In my freshwater group, my colleague in Japan and also in Cambodia, they are evaluating the impacts of dam construction and global warming to the fish biodiversity in the Mekong River Basin. And all these scientific findings and knowledge are referred to this IPBES assessment, which are influential to the decision-making processes for the biodiversity conservation. So finally, I just want to give you some message because I'm working in the university and I always try to share some thoughts how we can work together by networking between the different academic disciplines, scientific disciplines. I started my talk from the physiological ecology or ecophysiology, like focusing on the photosynthesis of ecosystems. By focusing on the ecosystem, we can understand ecosystem functions like CO2 absorption by the forest, or the climate change impacts of on the ecosystems like drought, heat stress, or cold stress. And by understanding these ecosystem functions, by mechanistic understanding of the ecosystem functions, then we can understand what is happening in our Earth system. So the question is that if we use the satellite remote sensing in many kinds of meteorological climatic data, we can combine them nicely, but still we need to always understand what is the mechanistic mechanisms behind these kind of consequences between the climatic data and the remote sensing data on land or ocean. So always we want to ask the biological questions to try to understand the Earth system changes and the ecosystem functions which support our daily lives and also the future. So I will stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much to Professor Hyoto. And I apologize for the